Thanks a lot for joining this talk today. I'm Tom Kaye with the Institute for Applied Ecology, and I'm going to give you a talk about coping with climate and how our changing environment is affecting native plants and habitat restoration in the Pacific Northwest and beyond. As you all know, climate change is altering the atmosphere of Earth and in turn, the very ground upon which we walk and all of the biota and everything that comes along with us. Some have referred to this as the Anthropocene, which is the age of humans, albeit however long. Climate change is happening. It's not just a forecasted future event, it's something we're living with today. And if you look at forecasts for the Pacific Northwest and Oregon in particular, as we're showing here, you can see that as this current century progresses, we are likely to see greater and greater increases in temperature. Precipitation, on the other hand, it's uncertain if we will see higher or lower precipitation, but regardless, it will be drier. And that's because as it gets hotter, evapotranspiration occurs. And even if you have the same amount of rainfall, it's still drier because of the heat. Another way to look at this throughout our region is shown here from the Climate Wizard website. And this shows you that no matter where you are in our region, temperatures are likely to rise at least about 3 degrees Fahrenheit by the end of the century, possibly more. And as you go east from the Northwest, it gets hotter and hotter and hotter. So it's not a uniform increase in temperature. The amount of temperature increase depends on where you are. This can be very upsetting for many of us. And there is a term for this. It is called solastalgia. And this is this sense and feeling of dread and grief about our changing environment, where we have no place to go. The places we found solace in are no longer there. And this painting by Frida Kahlo, the Hunted, really shows how some of us feel when our environment is harmed. We take it personally, we feel it. And these days of high temperatures, intense amounts of smoke and fire and other catastrophes, each one feels like an arrow sling. So we're reeling from this. And sometimes it's hard to focus back on what's going on in the biological world around us. And so I'm going to talk today about what's going on with plants in particular, some from my own work, but much of this from the research of others. Some of the effects of climate change are listed here, and we're going to cover these right now. Loss of biological diversity, changes in phenology, that's the timing of major events like flowering or leafing out or germination, etc. Range shifts, movement on the landscape of organisms to correspond to their climate better. Complex interactions with populations. When climate interacts with populations, it's not always simple, like it just causes plants to die more or leave out earlier. It affects various different life history patterns, and I'll talk very briefly about that. And finally, some of the rare and not so rare species that we see around us are faced with extinction, and that's happening. So currently, there are about 13,000, almost 14,000 threatened or extinct plants in the world. About 4% of the world's plant species are either on the verge of or already gone. And in the United States, the values are fairly similar, where about 5% of the US plant species are listed as threatened or endangered. And interestingly, about 20% of the plants in the US are non-native, they're invasive. So about 1/5 of the flora of the United States is from somewhere else. Now, I mentioned that diversity is declining in response to climate change. And here's one study, just one study that's looking at that. And these folks looked at plots that had been established by an ecologist back in the 1950s or right around 1950 And then they went back to these plots and resampled them. So there had been a big chunk of time between. So 1950, kind of pre-climate change events, and then much later in this century now. So what they found was that the number of plant species that they found in the plots had declined from when those plots had originally been put in, from around 12 to 15 plants per plot down to 4 or so. That's a huge decline in biological diversity. This is a real loss on the landscape. This was a study done in southern Oregon in the Klamath-Siskiyou area. Now, other folks are finding different things that plants are doing to respond to climate. For example, shifting their phenology. And in this study, where these people looked at herbarium specimens, plant specimens in museums over time to look at when life history events were taking place, they found that plants that bloom early in the season versus later in the season did different things. And plants that bloomed in the early part of the season, they're tending to move their phenology much more substantially than plants that bloom later. In other words, those things that bloom early are blooming much earlier than those things that bloom late are blooming a little earlier. Also, they found that this depended on the elevation that the plants were at. So at low elevations, plants tend to be moving their phenology, their blooming time much earlier compared to plants at higher elevations. So it depends on where you are, when you bloom, and what your elevation is. So in general, things are changing, but it's nuanced. There's some complexity to this. So the early bloomers are shifting earlier. The low elevation plants and maritime plants are shifting earlier, but the late bloomers and the things that are at high elevations or in arid landscapes, they're changing much less. Another way to look at this is there may be a lag between the effects of climate change that's caused by where plants grow. And on average, it's about a 4.5 days shift per degree centigrade of climate change. And so that adds up. Another study by some folks at University of Oregon has shown that ranges of plants may actually need to shift with climate change. So for example, these plants in the middle here, there's 2 on top of each other and one long one next to each other. Those plants, when they were manipulated experimentally and moved experimentally, they declined with heating and drought, but they grew better in the north than the south. In other words, the southern part of their range, they're starting to fade out. And in the northern part of their range, they're still doing okay. But if you artificially manipulate what's going on in the northern part of their range to represent what's going to happen with continued climate change, they will continue to die out there as well. So that's not a good sign for these species. Those plants on the left, these were moved from the southern part of their range beyond, up further north than the northern part of their range. And when you put them further north than they usually grow, then they showed improved population growth with heating and drought. So in other words, if you put them beyond their range limit to a place where it's too cold and wet for them, but then you warm it up to what the climate will be, then they do great. So that suggests that these species may need to move north, and when they're moved north, they will do fine with a changing climate. So interesting, the climate is changing out from under these species. They're not evolving rapidly enough to to tread water in place, it appears, and forced movement or assisted migration may be needed. This is true for trees as well. So here's a study that looked at trees from thousands of plots in the Pacific Northwest. And they looked at adult trees versus seedling trees and wanted to find out were the trees and their seedlings matched up in terms of what the climate they preferred. And what they found was no. At the southern part of species ranges, and there's about 33 the species here that are affected. In the southern part of their ranges, the seedlings are dying out, even though the trees are still there. So you have these mature trees that are hanging out on the landscape, but they're unable to reproduce. And that's not a good sign. They need to be able to reproduce. And if they can't, then eventually they will die out. So this is an early warning that some of these species are not able to maintain themselves in the southern part of their range currently. This is a study we were involved in, and we looked at population extinctions being driven by climate change, but how that's also affected by climate size and time. And we looked at an orchid species, Cypripedium fasciculatum, and a relative of it, Cypripedium montanum, but mostly the first one. And it's an interesting little orchid. It occurs in forested landscapes out in the primarily around Northern California and Southern Oregon, Siskiyou kind of environment, but also up into Washington and even across into Colorado. But what we found with this species, by going back to populations that hadn't been visited in a long time, was that their extinction, the rate at which they disappeared on the landscape, was associated with how big the population was. In other words, big populations tended to hang on the landscape and small ones tended to be vulnerable. Well, that makes sense. Also, the amount of time that went by affected how likely they were to remain on the landscape. So the longer the amount of time elapsed, the more likely they were to go extinct and disappear. Again, makes sense. But the other signal we picked up was the elevation at which they occur affects the likelihood that they will go extinct. Those low elevations that are affected more greatly by climate change, those populations are going extinct at a much higher rate than higher elevation populations. And when we look at the landscape of where these populations occur and color code their populations by their likelihood of extinction, we find that there are a lot of populations out there that are stable, but many that look vulnerable or have already gone extinct. And to the point where if we look at the database of where these species are supposed to occur on the landscape, only about 55% of those populations in California and Oregon are likely still present. So even our databases are overestimating what's going on the landscape. Now, here's a plant called Snake River goldenweed, and this plant occurs in eastern Oregon, where it's hot, it's arid, and moderate elevation. And what we found from doing long-term demographic research was that the vital rates of this population, the birth rate, the death rate, the growth rate, the seedling emergence, all those things were each connected to some different aspect of the climate. So different kinds of climatic years, like wet years versus dry years, hot years versus cold years, all affected the life history of this plant, but in different ways. Different parts of the plant's life cycle behaved or responded differently. And then when we put that all together in a computer model of how a population works, and then project that through time, given information on how the climate is likely to change, we find that if we just project forward with how the population was while we were observing the species, the population's likely to grow. But if we project it forward with a climate that is likely to change, either with a moderate or no climate action to reduce climate change, we found that the population's very likely to go extinct. So this is not a good sign for the species. It's vulnerable to climate change. So what do we do about all these things that add up to some messages of alarm for some of the plant species on our landscape? Well, one of the things we can look at is sourcing the plants for habitat restoration so that we are actually moving genes and moving species to accommodate the fact that the world is changing out from under them. But first, I want to point out something about local adaptation and then talk about future climate analogs and how we use local adaptation as a way to address this in the future. So in this study that we contributed to, us and our co-authors looked at local adaptation, and what we did was we looked at studies that had grown plants from multiple different populations on the landscape together in one place, so that when they responded to the local climate, the differences between them were genetic rather than from place to place. So they came from different places, were all grown together in one location called a common garden. And what we found was that 95% of the species we looked at showed variation among populations. That's the rule. Populations vary from place to place in things like could be flower size or leaf shape, or when they bloom or when they germinate. All these things come together in this one analysis. 86% of those had trait by environment variation. In other words, the things that varied in them were varying and in correlated ways to what the environment they came from. And 75% of that was climate variation. So climate variability explained the differences in 75% of the species from when they differed from place to place. And then finally, when we look at, did the local population have an advantage over the non-local populations? We found that yes, and 67%, 2/3 of the local populations outperformed the non-local populations, and nine in terms of survival, and 90% of them had improved flowering if they were local compared to from somewhere else. So local adaptation is real. In fact, it's the stuff of evolution. And it's occurring in such a way that it's largely driven by climate. So how do we use that to our advantage here? Well, one thing we can see is there's different ways to plan for climate. Different researchers or commentators have proposed different ideas. So it may mean that the changing climate it means the optimal environment for a species may change on the landscape. It may move to a new place, like north or upward, or south if you're in the southern hemisphere. And how we collect seeds to do restoration can help us address that climate change. We could just keep our seeds strictly local and ignore climate change. We could have a relaxed local where we just take things that are local and we mix them together to improve diversity and hope that there's something in that mix that improves adaptability to a future climate. We can make a composite mix or a range-wide admixture where we're bringing in more and more distant populations into a genetic mix. Or we can do a predictive matching where we say, look, the climate here is changing. It's going to become what it is now over here. So we want to collect our plant genetics from over here to move here to anticipate the future for here. So that's called the future climate analog. Skip to the next slide here and tell you a little bit about the seed lot selection tool that's climate smart. This allows the user to locate on the landscape where they're doing restoration and then ask, where is the climate like on the landscape today that matches what the climate will be in my restoration area. And when we look at an example from the Portland area and look at either mid-century or late century future climate analogs for that area, we see that we need to be looking to either southward in Oregon or all the way into California for some of our genetic material if we want the plants to be matched to the future climate. And we're actually involved in a project to test that out in the Portland area with the Clean Water Services and the Tualatin Soil and Water Conservation District. We're very excited to try these ideas out and see if some of these signals that we see from plants actually tell us that these plants will do better if we move them according to their climate. So that's my talk for today, and I hope I've given you some information that convinces you that climate change is affecting plants already. It's not just a hypothetical thing for the future. It's dire for some species, in fact, many, but we can respond to it by moving genetics and moving species that are better adapted to the locations where we're going to restore the landscape for our future enjoyment and future use and the future biological diversity on our planet. Thank you.